Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. Probably just me tonight. Dido is curled up on the sofa and she's been playing very hard. So I think she's sort of tuckered out for now. So we're back and this episode will be in two parts, as it were, finishing off the London section of the novel and moving on to a new location. You can see we're almost halfway through. This is very exciting. The brick is diminishing. I mean, we're on page 451 of 941. So we've got exactly 500 pages to go, which we will get through. It'll be good. Thank you to my loyal readers for sticking with me so far. It's gonna, yeah. It's all good. It's good. Let's go. Let's read. Chapter 2. A railing. I think it doesn't mean the things you have in the park, but we'll see. The next morning, the family purposed setting off as soon as breakfast was over. Young Delvile, however, waited not so long. The fineness of the weather tempted him, he said, to travel on horseback, and therefore he had risen very early and was already gone. Cecilia could not but wonder, yet did not repine. Just as breakfast was over, and Mr. and Mrs. Delvile and Cecilia were preparing to depart, to their no little surprise the door was opened, and out of breath with haste and with heat, in stumped Mr. Briggs. "So," cried he to Cecilia, "what's all this, eh? Where we're going? Coach at the door, horses to every wheel, servants fine as lords. What's in the wind now? Think to choose me out of my belongings?" "I thought, sir," said Cecilia, who instantly understood him, though Mr. and Mrs. Delvile stared at him in utter astonishment. "I had explained before I left you that I should not return." Didn't? Answered he angrily. "Waited for you 3 days, dressed a breast of mutton on purpose. Got in a lobster and 2 crabs, all spoilt by keeping. Stink already. Weather quite muggy. Forced to souse them in vinegar. One expense brings on another. Never begin the like again." "I am very sorry indeed," said Cecilia, much disconcerted, "if there has been any mistake through my neglect, but I had hoped I was understood, and I have been so much occupied." Aye, interrupted he. "Fine work. Rare doings. A merry Vauxhall with pistols at all your noddles. Thought as much. Thought he'd tip the perch. Saw he wasn't stanch. Knew he'd go by his company. A set of jackanapes, all blacklegs. Nobody warm among 'em. Fellows with a month's good living upon their backs, and not 6pence for the hangman in their pockets." Mrs. Delvile now, with a look of arch congratulation at Cecilia as the object of this agreeable visit, it not likely to being immediately concluded, returned to her chair. But Mr. Delvile, leaning sternly upon his cane, moved not from the spot where he stood at his entrance, but surveyed him from head to foot with the most astonished contempt at his undaunted vulgarity. "Well, I'd all your cash myself. Seize that else. Run out the constable for you. Next, I made you blow out your brains for company. Mind what I say, never give your mind for a gold lace hat. Many a one wears it don't know 5 farthings from 2pence. A good man always wears a bob wig, make that your rule. Ever seen Master Harold wear such a thing? No, I warrant. Better if he had, kept his head on his own shoulders. And now, pray, how does he cut up? What has he left behind him? A tway case, I suppose, and a bit of hat won't go on a man's head." Cecilia, perceiving with great confusion that Mr. Delvile, though evidently provoked by this intrusion, would not deign to speak, that Mr. Briggs might be regarded as belonging wholly to herself, hastily said, "I will not, sir, as your time is precious, detain you here, but as soon as it is in my power I will wait upon you in the city." Mr. Briggs, however, without listening to her, thought proper to continue his harangue. "Invited me once to his house, sent me a card, half of it printed like a book, t'other half a scrawl could not read, pretended to give us supper, all a mere bam. Went without my dinner, and got nothing to eat. All glass and show. Victuals painted all manner of colours, lighted up like a pastry cook on 12th day. Wanted something solid, and got a great lump of sweetmeat. Found it as cold as a stone, all froze in my mouth like ice. Made me jump again, and brought the tears to my eyes. Forced to spit it out. Believe it was nothing but a snowball, just set up for show, and covered over with a little sugar. Pretty way to spend money. Stuffing and piping and hopping, never could rest till every farthing was gone. Nothing left but his own fool's pate, and even that he could not hold together. At present, sir, said Cecilia, we are all going out of town. The carriage is waiting at the door, and therefore— No such thing, cried he. Shan't go. Come for you myself. Take you back to my own house. Got everything ready. Been to the broker's. Bought a nice blanket. Hardly a brack in it. Pick up a table soon. One in me eye. I am sorry you have so totally mistaken me, sir, for I am now going into the country with Mr. and Mrs. Delvile. Won't consent. Won't consent. What would you go there for? Hear of nothing but dead dukes. As well visit an old tomb. Here Mr. Delvile, who felt himself insulted in a manner he could least support, after looking at him very disdainfully, turned to Cecilia and said, Miss Beverley, if this person wishes for a longer conference with you, I am sorry you did not appoint a more seasonable hour for your interview. Ay, ay, cried the impenetrable Mr. Briggs. Want to hurry her off, see that, but 'twon't do. Am to be nicked. Choose to come in for my thirds, won't be gold. Shan't have more than your share. Sir, cried Mr. Delvile, with a look meant to be nothing less than petrific. What? cried he with an arch leer. All above it, eh? Warrant your Spanish Don never thinks of such a thing. Don't believe in my duck. Great crying little wool. No more the ready than other folks. Mere puff and go one. This is language, sir, said Mr. Delvile, so utterly incomprehensible that I presume you do not even intend it should be understood. Otherwise, I should very little scruple to inform you that no man of the name of Delvile brooks the smallest insinuation of dishonour. Don't he? returned Mr. Briggs with a grin. Why, how will he help it? Will the old grandees jump out of their graves to frighten us? What old grandees, sir? To whom are you pleased to allude? Why, all them old grandfathers and aunts you brag of. A set of poor souls you won't let rest in their coffins. Mere clay and dirt, fine things to be proud of. A parcel of old mouldy rubbish quite departed this life. Raking up bones and dust, nobody knows for what. Ought to be ashamed. Who cares for dead carcasses? Nothing but carrion. My little Tom's worth 40 of them. I can so ill make out, Miss Beverley, said the astonished Mr. Delvile, what this person is pleased to dive at, that I cannot pretend to enter into any sort of conversation with him. You will therefore be so good as to let me know when he has finished his discourse, and you are at leisure to set off. And then, with a very stately air, he was quitting the room, but was soon stopped upon Mr. Briggs calling out, Ay, ay, Don Duke, poking the old charnel houses by yourself. None of your defunct for me, and didn't care if they were all hung in a string. Who's the better for 'em? Pray, sir, cried Mr. Delvile, turning round, to whom were you pleased to address that speech? To one Don Puffendorf, replied Mr. Briggs. Know ever such a person, eh? Don who, sir? said Mr. Delvile, stalking nearer to him. I must trouble you to say that name over again. Suppose don't choose it. How then? I am to blame, said Mr. Delvile, scornfully waving his hand with a repulsive motion, to suffer myself to be irritated so unworthily, and I am sorry in my own house to be compelled to hint that the sooner I have it to myself, the better I shall be contented with it. Ay, want to get me off, want to have her to yourself, won't be so easily choused. Who's the better man, hey? Which do you think is warmest? And all got by myself, obliged never a grandee for a penny, what do you say to that? Will you cast an account with me? Very extraordinary, this, cried Mr. Delvile. The most extraordinary circumstance of the kind I ever met with. A person to enter my house in order to talk in this incomprehensible manner. A person who I hardly know by sight. Never mind, old Don, cried Briggs with a facetious nod. Know me better another time. Old who, sir? What? Come to a fair reckoning, continued Mr. Briggs. Suppose you were in my case, and had ne'er a farthing but of your own getting. Where would you be then? What would become of your fine coach and horses? You might stomp your feet off before you'd ever get into one. Where would be all this fine crockery work for your breakfast? You might pop your head under a pump or drink out of your own paw. What would you do for that fine jemmy tire? Where would you get a gold head to your stick? You might dig long enough in them cold vaults before any of your old grandfathers would pop out to give you one. Mr. Delvile, feeling more enraged than he thought suited his dignity, restrained himself from making any further answer, but going up to the bell, rang it with great violence. And as to ringing a bell, continued Mr. Briggs, you'd never know what it was in your life, unless you could make interest to be a dustman. A dustman, repeated Mr. Delvile, unable to command his silence any longer. I protest. And biting his lips, he stopped short. Aye, love it, don't you? Suits your taste. Why not one dust as well as another? Dust in a cart good as dust of a cardinal house. Don't smell half so bad. A servant now entering, Mr. Delvile called out, Is everything ready? Yes, sir. He then begged Mrs. Delvile to go into the coach, and telling Cecilia to follow when at leisure, left the room. I will come immediately, sir, said Cecilia. Mr. Briggs, I am sorry to leave you, and much concerned you have had this trouble, but I can detain Mr. Delvile no longer. And then away she ran, notwithstanding he repeatedly charged her to stay. He followed them, however, to the coach, with bitter revilings that everybody was to make more of his ward than himself, and with the most virulent complaints of his losses from the blanket, the breast of mutton, the crabs, and the lobster. Nothing, however, more was said to him. Cecilia, as if she had not heard him, only bowed her head, and the coach driving off, they soon lost sight of him. This incident by no means rendered the journey pleasant, or Mr. Delvile gracious. His own dignity, that constant object of his thoughts and his cares, had received a wound from this attack which he had not the sense to despise, and the vulgarity and impudence of Mr. Briggs, which ought to have made his familiarity and boldness equally contemptible and ridiculous, served only with a man whose pride outrun his understanding, to render them doubly mortifying and stinging. He could talk, therefore, of nothing the whole way that they went, but the extreme impropriety of which the Dean of whatever had been guilty, in exposing him to scenes and situations so much beneath his rank, by leaguing him with a person so coarse and disgraceful. They slept one night upon the road, and arrived the next day at Delvile Castle. So, exit Mr. Briggs. I can't remember if he appears again. Exit with a flourish, and the Delviles are off to Delvile Castle. Just pausing here, because I have various ideas of who to cast in my film version of Cecilia, and I've got a clear image of Mark Strong as Mr. Delvile Senior, and a young Susan Hampshire as Mrs. Delvile, who has a very distinct way of speaking that I try to emulate, but I don't think I've quite got it. As for young Delvile, I have quite a clear image and person in my mind, but as the person in question is not famous and you don't know who it is, saying anything further would be completely pointless. But I have an image in my head. Chapter 3. An Antique Mansion. Delvile Castle was situated in a large and woody park, and surrounded by a moat. A drawbridge which fronted the entrance was every night, by order of Mr. Delvile, with the same care as if still necessary for the preservation of the family, regularly drawn up. Some fortifications still remained entire, and vestiges were everywhere to be traced of more. No taste was shown in the disposition of the grounds, no openings were contrived through the wood for distant views or beautiful objects. The mansion house was ancient, large, and magnificent, but constructed with as little attention to convenience and comfort as to airiness and elegance. It was dark, heavy, and monastic, equally in want of repair and of improvement. The grandeur of its former inhabitants was everywhere visible, but the decay into which it was falling rendered such remains mere objects for meditation and melancholy, while the evident struggle to support some appearance of its ancient dignity made the dwelling and all in its vicinity wear an aspect of constraint and austerity. Festivity, joy, and pleasure seemed foreign to the purpose of its construction. Silence, solemnity, and contemplation were adapted to it only. Mrs. Delvile, however, took all possible care to make the apartments and situation of Cecilia commodious and pleasant, and to banish by her kindness and animation the gloom and formality which her mansion inspired. Nor were her efforts ungratefully received. Cecilia, charmed by every mark of attention from a woman she so highly admired, returned her solicitude by increasing affection, and repaid all her care by the revival of her spirits. She was happy indeed to have quitted the disorderly house of Mr. Harrel, where terror, so continually awakened, was only to be lulled by the grossest imposition, and though her mind, depressed by what was past, and in suspense with what was to come, was by no means in a state for uninterrupted enjoyment, yet to find herself placed at last without effort or impropriety in the very mansion she had so long considered as her road to happiness, rendered her, notwithstanding her remaining sources of inquietude, more contented than she had yet felt herself since her departure from Suffolk. Even the imperious Mr. Delvile was more supportable here than in London. Secure in his own castle, he looked around him with a pride of power and of possession which softened while it swelled him. His superiority was undisputed, his will was without control. He was not, as in the great capital of the kingdom, surrounded by competitors. No rivalry disturbed his peace, no equality mortified his greatness. All he saw were either vassals of his power, or guests bending to his pleasure. He abated, therefore, considerably the stern gloom of his haughtiness, and soothed his proud mind by the courtesy of condescension. Little, however, was the opportunity Cecilia found for evincing that spirit and forbearance she had planned in relation to Delvile. He breakfasted by himself every morning, rode or walked out alone till driven home by the heat of the day, and spent the rest of his time till dinner in his own study. When he then appeared, his conversation was always general, and his attention not more engaged by Cecilia than by his mother. Left by them with his father, sometimes he appeared again at tea time, but more commonly he rode or strolled out to some neighbouring family, and it was always uncertain whether he was again seen before dinner the next day. By this conduct reserve on her part was rendered totally unnecessary. She could give no encouragement where she met with no assiduity. She had no occasion to fly where she was never pursued. Strange, however, she thought such behaviour, and utterly impossible to be the effect of accident. His desire to avoid her seemed scrupulous and pointed, and however to the world it might wear the appearance of chance, to her watchful anxiety 1,000 circumstances marked it for design. She found that his friends at home had never seen so little of him. Complaints were continually made of his frequent absences, and much surprise was expressed at his new manner of life, and what might be the occupations which so strangely engrossed his time. Had her heart not interfered in this matter, she might now have been perfectly at rest, since she was spared the renunciation she had projected, and since, without either mental exertion or personal trouble, the affair seemed totally dropped, and Delvile, far from manifesting any design of conquest, shunned all occasions of gallantry, and sedulously avoided even common conversation with her. If he saw her preparing to walk out in an evening, he was certain to stay at home. If his mother was with her and invited him to join them, he was sure to be ready with some other engagement, and if by accident he met her in the park, he merely stopped to speak of the weather, bowed, and hurried on. How to reconcile a coldness so extraordinary with a fervour so animated as that which he had lately shown was indeed not easy. Sometimes she fancied he had entangled not only the poor Henrietta but himself. At other times she believed him merely capricious, but that he studied to avoid her she was convinced invariably, and such a conviction was alone sufficient to determine her upon forwarding his purpose. And when her first surprise was over, and first chagrin abated, her own pride came to her aid, and she resolved to use every method in her power to conquer a partiality so ungratefully bestowed. She rejoiced that in no instance she had ever betrayed it, and she saw that his own behaviour prevented all suspicion of it in the family. Yet in the midst of her mortification and displeasure, she found some consolation in seeing that those mercenary views of which she had once been led to accuse him were furthest from his thoughts, and that whatever was the state of his mind, she had no artifice to apprehend, nor design to guard against. Oh, there's mewing. And the cat has disappeared. Ah, she's sitting in front of the table. Dido, have you come to read? Brief appearance. Now she's investigating the laptop. She hasn't been on the table yet. She's... maybe don't